She was only 6 when she whispered, "She paid the nurse to lie." And in that moment, the millionaire CEO realized everything he believed about his perfect wife was a lie. Edward Harris was a man the world watched, a tech mogul, a respected CEO, a billionaire under 30. The headlines called him brilliant, driven, unstoppable. His company, Helix Systems, had reshaped digital security worldwide, and investors praised his every move. But few people saw past the public figure. Fewer still knew the man who, behind the immaculate suits and pristine office towers, carried the weight of a deep private loss. 6 years ago, Edward's wife, Emily, had died giving birth to their daughter. The grief had been all-consuming. One moment he was holding his newborn child in trembling arms. The next he was signing death certificates and receiving sympathy letters he never read. In the chaos of building an empire, he had never planned for single fatherhood. But Sophie had saved him. She had become his purpose. A quiet, wide-eyed little girl with chestnut brown eyes and a tenderness in her soul that sometimes startled him. They lived in a modern estate nestled in the hills outside San Francisco. Quiet, secure, surrounded by trees and distance. From the outside, it looked like a dream. A father and daughter safe behind gates, cared for by a loyal staff, every need met. But Edward knew that no amount of security or wealth could replace a mother. And despite his best efforts, there were moments. Bedtime stories left half-finished, scraped knees patched up too quickly, questions about the past he didn't always know how to answer, when he felt like he was simply surviving fatherhood, not living it. Then came Alexis. They met at a tech philanthropy gala. She was 25, strikingly beautiful, with honey blonde hair and sharp brown eyes that shimmered when she smiled. She worked with nonprofits that specialized in digital arts education, and she had a way of making everyone around her feel like they were the only person in the room. Edward had never expected to feel drawn to anyone again, but Alexis's warmth was disarming. She didn't ask him about Emily. She didn't seem intimidated by his reputation. She laughed, she listened, and she challenged him. Their relationship moved fast. Too fast, perhaps. Within months, she was visiting the estate regularly. Within a year, she was living there. Edward wasn't blind to the change. He saw the way Sophie withdrew a little more each time Alexis entered the room, how she clung to her bunny longer at night, how she grew quieter during dinners. But he chalked it up to adjustment. Change was hard, especially for children. Alexis, for her part, tried to bond with Sophie, or at least that's what she said. She bought her gifts. She praised her drawings. She volunteered to read to her before bed, though Sophie always asked for Edward instead. Still, he believed they would find their rhythm eventually. Alexis was patient with him, affectionate, understanding of his long hours and cautious heart. And when she told him she was pregnant, Edward felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. He remembered standing in the kitchen that morning, Alexis smiling with soft tears in her eyes, holding out the test like it was a golden ticket to redemption. "I know it's soon," she said, "but I want this. I want us." And he believed her. Sophie, however, did not. She said little when she was told about the baby. No jumping, no questions, no childish excitement. Just a nod and a quiet, "Okay." When Edward asked her later what she thought about being a big sister, she looked down at her hands and said, "I don't think she's telling the truth." It startled him. "What do you mean?" "I think she's lying." "About the baby." He had laughed gently, brushing her hair behind her ear. "That's a big thing to say, sweetheart." "She talks on the phone when she thinks I'm not listening," Sophie said. "She says weird things." Edward paused, but then sighed. Children had wild imaginations, especially when they were scared of losing attention. He kissed her forehead and told her everything would be okay. But that night, Sophie didn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her bunny tucked under her arm like a shield. Something in her small body was tight, alert. She knew something wasn't right, and soon she would learn just how dangerous the truth could be. Sophie began to notice things that no one else seemed to see. To most adults, Alexis was radiant, generous, even loving, especially now that she was expecting. She floated through the estate like a crowned queen, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, accepting congratulations from staff and guests with gracious smiles. Edward, though still cautious, was slowly opening his heart again. He had started planning a nursery, revisiting old parenting books, even imagining how Sophie would look holding a newborn sibling. But Sophie's quiet observations painted a different picture. At 6 years old, she didn't have the words for what she felt, but she knew what truth looked like, and this wasn't it. Alexis would whisper on the phone in the hallway when she thought no one was nearby. "No, I told him already." "Yes, he believed me," Sophie once heard her say behind the staircase curtain. Another time from her bedroom vent, Sophie caught pieces of another call. "Don't worry, I'll take care of the hospital paperwork. He's rich. He won't ask questions." Sophie began keeping a notebook in her room. She didn't know exactly why. Maybe it was something she'd seen in cartoons or in one of the detective books George had let her borrow. But she started drawing what she heard and saw. Pictures of Alexis talking on the phone with a shadowy figure, diagrams of the house, sketches of faces with big red X marks, and speech bubbles with words like fake and lie. One afternoon, she quietly approached George in the garden. George had been the estate's groundskeeper since before Sophie was born. He was a kind, bearded man with soft eyes and slow hands. He'd helped her plant her first sunflower and taught her how to coax butterflies into landing on her sleeve. She trusted him with everything, even the scary parts. She tugged at his sleeve as he was trimming the roses. "George," she said in a hushed voice, "can I tell you a secret?" He put down his shears and knelt beside her. "You know you can, little miss." "She's lying," Sophie whispered. "About the baby. I think she paid someone to pretend." George blinked. "That's a big thing to say. Are you sure?" Sophie nodded, her eyes solemn. "I heard her on the phone. And the nurse? I don't think she's real. The one from the hospital." George didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss her. He looked at her carefully, like a man listening for something important. "Why would she do something like that?" he asked. "She wants to stay, to make Daddy keep her forever." George's gaze sharpened just slightly. "Have you told your father?" "I did. He thinks I'm just scared or jealous. But I'm not." George rubbed his chin. "Okay, you did the right thing telling me. Now we need to be very careful." Over the next few days, George paid closer attention. He saw the signs Sophie had mentioned. Alexis was always on edge when Sophie entered the room. Her phone was always clutched tightly in her hand. She avoided discussions about prenatal checkups unless Edward brought them up. And even then, she changed the topic quickly. When she did mention doctor visits, it was always vague. Just enough detail to sound convincing, but never specifics. Then came the day Sophie saw Alexis exchange something with a woman in scrubs by the back gate. A white envelope, passed quickly and tucked into the nurse's bag. The woman barely stayed 10 seconds. Sophie ran to find George, her voice shaking. She gave the nurse money. I saw it. That night, George did something he hadn't done in years. He called in a favor. His nephew worked part-time in administrative support at the same private medical clinic Alexis claimed to visit. The next morning, George received confirmation. Alexis was not listed as a patient there. She had never been registered under her name or any alias the office could find. There was no record of her ever being seen. George's stomach dropped. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was adding up, and the child had seen what the adults had missed. The next day, George asked Sophie for her notebook. She handed it to him like it was a sacred artifact. He flipped through the pages, crude crayon drawings but painfully specific. He saw his own face, Alexis, Edward, a woman in a nurse's outfit. There was a drawing of a hospital with big red question marks floating above it. One page simply read in capital letters, "She is lying." George didn't sleep that night. He knew that Edward wouldn't be easily convinced. The man had wrapped his heart in steel for years, and now that he had dared to unlock it again, it would be nearly impossible to make him see the truth unless it was laid bare before him. But Sophie had seen it, and she had heard it. And George now knew that if they waited too long, Alexis would succeed in weaving herself into the family's legacy by deceit. It wasn't just about protecting Edward anymore. It was about protecting Sophie from being silenced. From being erased, the air inside the Reeves estate felt strangely heavy as the days ticked by. Alexis was glowing more than ever, but not in a way that spoke of motherhood. It was a glow of triumph, of a person who believed the game was already won. She walked the halls of the house like a crowned queen, caressing her flat stomach with performative tenderness, slipping into expensive maternity clothes, planning gender reveal teas with stylists and florists who were paid not to ask questions. Edward was swept up in the image of it all. After years of loneliness and grieving, the idea of new life, of rebuilding the family he'd once lost, had captured his heart completely. His logical mind, so sharp in business, dulled in matters of love. He wanted to believe he'd finally been given a second chance. But Sophie knew better, and now George did too. They had proof. Or at least, they had enough to see through the curtain Alexis had carefully hung in front of everyone. But if they were going to expose her, it couldn't be with whispers and suspicion. It needed to be undeniable. Edward needed to be shown the truth, clearly, without room for manipulation. That opportunity came sooner than expected. On a Monday afternoon, Alexis announced with theatrical excitement that she had scheduled her official hospital scan, an appointment to determine the baby's gender. She asked Edward to come, but conveniently he had a board meeting he couldn't reschedule. "It's okay," she said, brushing his cheek with perfectly manicured fingers. "I'll take the nurse with me again, the one from last time. It'll be recorded. You'll see everything." George and Sophie exchanged a glance. This was it. That evening, as Alexis claimed to be at the hospital, George made a call to his nephew again, the one at the clinic. And just like before, no appointment had been scheduled. No scan, no visit, no Alexis Harris on the list. At the same time, Sophie did what no one expected of a 6-year-old. She recorded Alexis's phone call. From behind the kitchen door, using a voice memo app George had taught her how to use, she captured a 15-minute conversation. Alexis, on speakerphone, talking to the same woman in scrubs they'd seen behind the gate. "I don't need another scan," Alexis said. "He just wants to hear some kind of medical jargon. I'll make up the numbers. You just nod when I say them. Got it?" The woman's voice crackled through the phone. "And the money?" "Same as before. Don't worry, once I'm listed in the will, you'll be taken care of." Sophie stopped the recording. Her fingers were trembling, but her eyes were clear. The next morning, George copied the file onto a USB drive and printed out the transcript. He placed it in a sealed envelope and slid it into Edward's briefcase with a note. "Before you give your heart away again, please open this." But fate rarely waits. That very evening, Alexis came home earlier than expected. She looked radiant, flushed with excitement, carrying a manila folder filled with test results and glossy sonogram images. She greeted Edward with a kiss, dropped the folder on the counter, and turned to Sophie with an empty smile. "Would you like to know if you're getting a brother or sister?" she asked in a syrupy voice. Sophie stared at her, expression unreadable. "No, thank you," she said calmly, and walked out of the room. Edward chuckled awkwardly. "She's still adjusting. You know, kids." But Alexis's eyes flicked to George, who stood silently at the doorway. Something in her gaze changed. Just for a second, a flicker of suspicion. Later that night, George found Edward in the study. "You read it?" he asked. Edward nodded slowly, eyes distant, hand gripping the USB tightly. "I listened to it 5 times, he said. His voice was quiet, devastated. "She played me. All this time." George didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The truth had finally breached the gates. "She used my daughter's grief," Edward continued. "She turned my house into a stage and made me an actor in her lie." "But you know now," George said gently. "And that matters." Edward stood, the lines around his eyes deeper than ever. "Does Sophie know I believe her?" "No," George replied. "She's waiting to find out." Edward left the study in silence. He found Sophie sitting cross-legged on the floor of the nursery she had helped design for the baby. Her bunny sat in her lap. She was tracing the outline of clouds on the wall with one finger. He sat beside her. "I listened to your recording," he said. She looked up slowly. Her eyes were careful, as if bracing for disbelief. "You were right," he said, "about everything." Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't believe you soon enough." Sophie crawled into his arms and buried her face in his chest. "You believe me now," she whispered, and he held her there for a long, long time. The storm had begun, but the silence between father and daughter, the one built by fear and doubt, had finally been broken. And in its place, trust had taken root, stronger than betrayal, stronger than lies, ready to stand through whatever came next. The next morning began like any other, but beneath the polished surface of routine, everything had changed. Edward stood at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee with a steady hand, but his eyes were cold and distant. Across the room, Alexis chatted on the phone with feigned innocence, her tone light, her laugh practiced. She was planning a brunch with a few select guests to announce the gender of the baby. Guests who happened to be potential business partners, investors, media connections. She was staging a perfect little family moment for an audience that didn't know they were watching a lie. Sophie sat at the table, quietly eating her cereal, her bunny tucked under one arm. She hadn't spoken much since last night. She didn't have to. Her father's silence was enough. Edward was thinking, processing, containing. He had listened to the recording again after Sophie had gone to bed. Every word, every manipulated phrase from Alexis was now burned into his mind. His heart twisted with shame, not just for falling for the lie, but for letting Sophie carry the burden alone for so long. But now he had a plan. He called his lawyer first thing and scheduled a private meeting for the afternoon. Then he asked George to keep Sophie close and safe. Not out of fear that Alexis would harm her, but because the truth was about to explode, and Edward wanted his daughter far away from the debris. The brunch began at noon in the glass garden room. Alexis wore a flowing pale blue dress, her makeup perfect, her smile immaculate. Guests arrived in tailored suits and designer dresses, sipping champagne and commenting on the charm of the event. A string quartet played softly in the background. Everything looked like a dream. Edward played along. He greeted guests. He shook hands. He smiled at Alexis when expected. But behind his eyes was something else entirely. A storm building. Alexis stood before a pastel balloon display and gave a short, syrupy speech about love, new beginnings, and the joy of expanding their family. Then she lifted a glitter-filled envelope and turned to Edward. "Would you do the honors?" she asked sweetly, handing it to him. Edward took the envelope, slowly, deliberately. Instead of opening it, he turned toward the guests. "I have something to say first." The room quieted. The quartet stopped playing. Alexis froze. "I want to thank you all for being here," Edward said, "for celebrating what I thought was the start of a new chapter." His voice was calm, too calm. "But it turns out, we've all been celebrating a lie." Gas fluttered through the room like wind through leaves. He pulled the USB from his pocket and held it up. "This device contains a conversation between my wife and a woman she paid to impersonate a nurse, to fabricate medical documents, and to help her maintain a fake pregnancy for the last several months." All eyes turned to Alexis. She went pale. "That's insane," she snapped. "He's lying." Edward didn't even look at her. "There are bank transfers, phone records, even voice memos recorded by the only person in this house brave enough to tell the truth." He looked toward the doorway, where George stood with Sophie, who had just arrived. Her small hand was wrapped in George's, but her chin was high. "She's 6 years old," Edward continued, "and she saw what none of us wanted to see. She tried to warn me. I didn't listen, but now I do." The room was silent. No music, no movement. Alexis stepped forward. "You're humiliating me in front of our friends." "Don't," Edward said sharply, turning to her. "You stood in this house and made a mockery of love. You manipulated my grief, used my daughter's silence, and tried to chain yourself to this family with deceit." Her voice cracked. "You can't prove. I already did. The files have been submitted to my attorney and the authorities. This house is no longer your stage. You'll leave today." Alexis tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her mask had shattered. The guests, stunned and murmuring, began to retreat, no longer interested in the show. Edward turned to Sophie, kneeling beside her. "You told the truth," he said, "even when no one believed you. That's what heroes do." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I didn't want her to hurt you." "She didn't," he said, "because you stopped her." George put a hand on Edward's shoulder. "She's safe now." That night, after Alexis was escorted from the estate with her things, and after the media vans had parked outside the gates, hungry for a story, Edward tucked Sophie into bed with more tenderness than ever before. He sat beside her long after she'd fallen asleep, the glow of the nightlight casting soft shadows across her face. The lie had ended. The truth had come forward. And in the silence that followed the chaos, Edward felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because the world was perfect, not because the pain was gone, but because love, real, steady, enduring love, had won. And it had come from the smallest, bravest voice in the room. The following days were quiet, but it was not the kind of quiet born from stillness. It was a deep, reflective silence, the kind that comes after a storm has passed and the air is still thick with what it left behind. The estate, once filled with tension and whispers, felt lighter. The staff moved through the halls with softened steps. The walls no longer echoed with the performance Alexis had crafted. She was gone, but her presence still lingered in subtle ways. Perfume clinging faintly to the guest bathroom, an untouched maternity book on the nightstand in the master bedroom, an empty teacup left on the terrace table. Ghosts of deceit. Edward stood alone in his office, looking out through the wide windows at the back garden where Sophie and George were planting flowers. The same garden where Alexis had hosted fake brunches and staged photo opportunities. Now it was quiet, real, grounded. His phone buzzed, a message from his lawyer confirming Alexis's swift departure had been finalized with an emergency dissolution filing. A restraining order had been placed. The media frenzy had already begun to fade. Another scandal tossed into the pile of corporate gossip and public betrayals. He didn't care. His world wasn't outside the gate anymore. It was in that garden, with his daughter. He stepped away from the window and walked slowly outside. George looked up first, giving him a small nod. Sophie was kneeling by a flower bed, her yellow sundress dusty at the knees, a pink tulip bulb cupped in her hands. "Can I put this one here?" she asked, looking up at her father. Edward crouched beside her. "That's the perfect spot." She placed the bulb gently into the soil and patted it down with a small trowel. She didn't speak for a while, and neither did he. It was a comfortable silence, one filled with unsaid things they were still learning to share. Finally, Sophie glanced over and asked, "Is she going to come back?" "No," Edward said gently. "She won't." "Are you mad at me?" "For what I did?" He looked at her, surprised. "Why would I be mad?" "Because I ruined her party," she whispered. Edward reached out and took her dirt-covered hands into his. "You didn't ruin anything. You saved us." She blinked. "Even if you liked her?" He nodded. "Especially then, because sometimes adults don't see clearly when they want something badly. I wanted to believe she was good, and I ignored what you saw. But you were brave. You told the truth." Sophie didn't speak. She simply leaned forward and hugged him tightly, bearing her face into his chest. He held her, his eyes closing, breathing in the scent of summer and soil and his daughter's hair. They stayed like that for a long time. That evening, they watched a movie together in the living room, something animated and light. Edward didn't check his phone once. He didn't respond to emails. He didn't read the article that called him the billionaire deceived by beauty. None of it mattered anymore. After Sophie fell asleep on the couch, he carried her up to her room and tucked her into bed. The nightlight glowed soft yellow, casting a warm circle on the wall. He sat beside her for a while, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, and remembered the words she had said just days before. "She's lying about the baby." It still stunned him how clearly she had seen it, how alone she had been in knowing. When he rose to leave, Sophie stirred. "Daddy, I'm here. Can we plant something for Mommy tomorrow?" His breath caught for a moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "We'll plant something beautiful." The next morning, they chose a spot under the tall oak near the garden's edge. The tree had been there longer than the house, older than Edward's business, older even than the idea of family he once clung to. They planted white lilies, Emily's favorite flower. Sophie wrote her mother's name on a smooth river stone and placed it beside them. Edward didn't cry, not because he wasn't moved, but because this didn't feel like grief. It felt like peace, like a beginning. As they stood side by side, hands muddy, hearts a little steadier, he realized something important. Love wasn't just about who stayed, it was about who stood up, who spoke when it mattered, who told the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. And Sophie, his little girl, had done all of that. She hadn't just saved him from a lie. She had saved him from forgetting who he was meant to be. Autumn settled softly over the Reeves estate, painting the edges of the trees with golden copper. The air carried a coolness that hadn't been there just weeks ago. The long summer days had given way to shorter afternoons, but within the walls of the home, a new warmth had taken root. It wasn't the kind that came from fireplaces or wool blankets. It came from healing, from quiet mornings, from the sound of laughter slowly returning to a house that had spent too long holding its breath. Edward had changed, subtly but profoundly. He still wore suits to meetings, still spoke at conferences, and appeared on magazine covers. But his presence in the home was different. He no longer rushed. He lingered at the breakfast table with Sophie, letting her tell stories in her own winding, imaginative way. He asked about her drawings, her dreams, her thoughts. And when he looked at her now, it wasn't with the distracted love of a busy father. It was with the full attention of a man who knew just how easily he could have lost everything. They had started new routines. On Sunday mornings, they walked the edge of the estate, collecting fallen leaves. On Thursday evenings, they baked cookies, even if the kitchen ended up looking like a flower storm had passed through. Edward had learned that Sophie liked warm milk before bed, that she always slept with her bunny facing the door, and that she had a hidden talent for building little stories from shadows on the wall. He was learning to be present, and Sophie? She was beginning to breathe again. The nightmares had stopped. The cautious way she tiptoed around conversations was gone. She smiled more, big open smiles that reached her eyes. She had returned to her old self, but stronger, wiser in ways most six-year-olds never needed to be. George was still there, tending to the garden, watching from the background with a gentle kind of pride. He had become a fixture in their lives, not just the gardener, but a companion, a protector. Sophie often sat beside him while he worked, asking questions about soil and sun and how to tell when a flower was ready to bloom. One afternoon, she told him softly, "I think I'm like one of the flowers. I was scared, but now I'm growing again." George smiled but didn't speak. He didn't need to. Some truths were best honored in silence. Meanwhile, Edward had quietly begun transforming the room that had once been planned as a nursery. After Alexis's departure, he had locked it, unable to even look at the pale blue wallpaper or the untouched crib. But now it had a new purpose, one that Sophie herself had inspired. She had drawn something in one of her notebooks, a little sketch of a room filled with books and stars, pillows and a telescope, with the words "My Thinking Place" scrawled underneath. Edward had taken that drawing and built it. One Saturday morning, he blindfolded Sophie and led her down the hall. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded, bouncing with excitement. He opened the door, gently removed the blindfold, and stepped back. Sophie gasped. The walls were painted a deep twilight blue, dotted with tiny silver stars. A telescope stood by the window, angled toward the sky. There were shelves filled with books, a cozy reading nook with soft blankets, bean bags shaped like planets, and in the center of the room, a desk just her size, with her drawing framed above it. Sophie ran into the room, turning in circles, touching everything with reverent fingers. "You made this?" she asked. "I just followed your plan," Edward said. She looked up at him. "It's perfect." He knelt down beside her. "It's yours. For thinking. For dreaming. For anything you want." She threw her arms around his neck. "Thank you, Daddy." Later that night, after she'd fallen asleep under her star-covered ceiling, Edward stood in the doorway of the room, watching her breathe. He thought about all the things that had tried to pull their lives apart, the lies, the betrayal, the loss. And he thought about the single thread that had held it all together. Her small voice, her courage, her unshakable love. She had seen the truth when he hadn't. She had spoken it when no one else would. And now she was the center of everything he was rebuilding. Not out of guilt, but out of love. Real, enduring, and earned. And in that quiet moment, Edward made a silent promise. Not just to protect her, but to never again underestimate the voice of a child brave enough to tell the truth. Especially when that child was his daughter. The sky above the Reeves estate was overcast that morning. The kind of soft, silvery gray that made everything below it feel more still. A light breeze moved through the trees, rustling leaves just beginning to turn gold and red, hinting that the full arrival of autumn was near. Inside the house, it was warm, calm, quiet, but not empty. Not anymore. Edward stood in the entryway, holding a box. It wasn't large, but it was heavy with meaning. Inside were the last of Alexis's things, items that had escaped the original sweep. A forgotten scarf, a necklace she once claimed was a family heirloom, and a leather-bound journal he'd found tucked at the bottom of the closet. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. Her story had ended the moment her lies were exposed. He simply closed the lid and walked it out to the trash, placing it there without ceremony. When he returned inside, Sophie was waiting in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, surrounded by coloring pencils and sheets of paper. She was drawing again. Lately, she'd been filling her sketchbooks with trees and stars, animals with wings, gardens and family portraits. But what Edward noticed most was the shift in tone. Her drawings weren't dark anymore. They were bright, playful, even hopeful. She looked up and smiled as he walked in. "Did you throw it away?" she asked. "I did," he said gently. Sophie nodded, then went back to coloring. George arrived a few minutes later, carrying a wooden crate filled with small jars of paint and seed packets. He'd promised Sophie that they'd build a miniature greenhouse together, a place for her to grow whatever she wanted, flowers, herbs, even strawberries if she was patient. Edward had offered to hire a professional to build one, but Sophie had insisted she wanted to do it with George, the real way. Outside, the three of them worked in the cool air, setting the first beams into place. Sophie helped where she could, handing nails to George, holding measuring tape while Edward worked. She laughed when she accidentally got dirt on her nose, and Edward laughed with her, the sound light and unguarded in a way it hadn't been for years. After hours of work, the basic frame was up, and the sun was beginning to set. The light fell through the trees in long golden bands, turning everything it touched into amber. George packed up the tools and promised to return in the morning to continue, while Sophie dashed inside to wash up. Edward remained on the back lawn, hands in his pockets, watching the breeze shift the grass. His mind wandered, not to the past, but to something he hadn't let himself think about in years: the future. He thought about how close he had come to making a mistake that would have haunted them forever. Not just believing Alexis, but almost building a life around her. He had been so focused on recreating the illusion of family, he had nearly ignored the one that was already standing in front of him: his daughter, his first family, his only real one. Inside the house, Sophie had changed into pajamas and was waiting by the window. When she saw him still outside, she opened it and called softly, "Daddy?" He turned and smiled. "Coming." They read together that night, one of Sophie's favorite stories about a girl who planted a magic seed and watched it grow into a tree that could speak. After the final page, she curled under her blanket and asked, "Will we finish the greenhouse tomorrow?" "Of course," he said. "Even if it rains? We'll build it in the rain." She grinned, content. Edward tucked her in and turned off the light, but before he reached the door, she said, "Daddy?" "Yes? Are we happy now?" He turned to look at her, surprised not by the question, but by the depth behind it. He walked back to her bed, knelt down and took her hand. "I think we're learning how to be," he said. "One day at a time." Sophie nodded, satisfied. Outside her window, the stars were beginning to emerge through the thinning clouds. The wind had died down, and the world had grown still again. But this time the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like peace. It felt like something real taking root, slowly, quietly, with no need for pretending. A new season had arrived, not just in the air but in their lives. One where truth had room to breathe. One where love wasn't loud or showy, but present, steady, strong. And in that moment, Edward knew. They were no longer trying to rebuild the life they lost. They were finally building the life they deserved. The first frost of the season came quietly overnight. By morning, the grass on the far side of the garden glistened with a thin layer of silver. Sophie pressed her face against the window, watching her breath fog up the glass as she traced small hearts into the mist. She was wearing her favorite sweater, the one with the stars and the big front pocket where her stuffed bunny sometimes peeked out. Downstairs, the fireplace crackled softly, and the whole house felt like it had exhaled into a slower, calmer rhythm. It had been months since Alexis's departure, since the lies unraveled, since Sophie stood at the center of a storm and spoke the truth that no adult dared to believe. And though the wound left behind by the betrayal had not disappeared, it had begun to close, stitched together by quiet moments, by time, by love that asked for nothing but to be true. Edward stood in the kitchen, brewing tea instead of coffee, humming under his breath. It wasn't something he'd done before, not in the years after Emily's death, not during the chaos that followed, but now it came naturally. The mornings had become rituals between him and Sophie. Tea, toast, a shared laugh. She would sit at the island with her bunny in her lap, and he would listen. Not just hear her voice, but really listen. That morning, as they ate breakfast, Edward slid a small box across the table to her. It was wrapped in soft blue paper, tied with a silver ribbon. Sophie tilted her head. "What's this?" "Open it," he said. She untied the ribbon carefully and lifted the lid. Inside was a silver chain with a small heart-shaped locket. She opened it slowly. On one side was a picture of her mother, young, glowing, holding baby Sophie in her arms. On the other side, a recent photo, Sophie and Edward in the garden, both smiling, dirt on their hands from planting flowers. She looked up at him, eyes wide and soft. "You made this?" "I had it made," he said. "So you always know who you are, where you come from, and how loved you are." She threw her arms around him, nearly knocking over her plate. He laughed and held her tightly. Later that afternoon, Edward took her on a surprise trip. They drove north, out of the city, through winding tree-lined roads that curved into the hills. Sophie asked a dozen questions, but he refused to tell her where they were going. She guessed every possible place: an amusement park, a candy store, a bookstore with a secret door. But when the car turned down a gravel road and pulled into a small clearing, her voice fell quiet. It was a cabin, small, made of cedar and stone, tucked between two old maple trees that were glowing orange with the season. A small creek ran behind it, and a wooden swing hung from a thick branch nearby. Smoke curled from the chimney. Warm light spilled from the windows. "This is ours now," Edward said, watching her expression. "Ours," he nodded. "A place to come when the world gets too loud. A place just for you and me." She stared at it, motionless. Then she whispered, "Is it safe?" Edward smiled gently. "Yes, very safe." Inside, the cabin was cozy. Books lined the walls, blankets draped over every chair. The kitchen was stocked, and in the main room, a fireplace crackled with a welcome that felt alive. They spent the weekend there, reading, playing cards, roasting marshmallows. At night, Sophie sat on Edward's lap by the fire and asked him to tell her stories. Not ones from books, but real ones. About her mother, about when she was a baby, about the way their life used to feel before it broke apart and had to be put back together again. And he told her everything. He told her about the way Emily used to dance barefoot in the kitchen when no one was looking. How she sang lullabies in French, even though she barely knew the words. How Sophie had once grabbed his finger with her whole hand and refused to let go, even in sleep. Sophie cried, but not out of sadness. "I wish I remembered her," she whispered. Edward kissed the top of her head. "She's in you. I see her every day." They left the cabin with full hearts and a new plan. They would come back every season, once a month, just the two of them. No phones, no business, just time. When they returned home, George was waiting with something of his own. A wooden bench he had carved by hand and placed beneath the oak tree in the garden, where Sophie and Edward had planted lilies for Emily. On the back of the bench, burned into the wood, were the words, "Truth, Love, Home." Sophie ran her fingers across the letters, then sat down and pulled her knees to her chest. "It's like everything is stitched back together," she said. Edward sat beside her. "It is. Not perfect, not untouched, but whole." And as the wind moved through the garden and the last light of day touched the top of the house, Edward realized something he hadn't been able to name until now. This wasn't just the end of the storm. It was the beginning of their forever. This story, at its core, is not just about deception or betrayal. It's about restoration. It begins with a lie, but it ends with truth. Not the kind shouted in courtrooms or broadcast in headlines, but the quiet, brave truth spoken by a child who refused to stay silent. Sophie's courage is the emotional backbone of this story. She represents the idea that truth doesn't need volume to be powerful, only persistence and heart. Her love for her father, her quiet observation of the world, and her decision to speak up even when no one believed her are what ultimately saved not just Edward's future, but his sense of self. Edward's transformation is just as important. A man who once believed control and image where everything learns to slow down, listen, and trust the smallest voice in the room. His arc reminds us that redemption isn't about perfection. It's about recognizing when you've been wrong and choosing differently when it matters most. The ending isn't wrapped in drama or revenge. It's gentle, warm, and real. The treehouse, the garden, the cabin. These aren't grand symbols of wealth or power. They're symbols of presence, of love rebuilt, one moment at a time. I believe the beauty of this story is that it doesn't scream. It breathes. And in that quiet, it shows us that the strongest families aren't the ones that look perfect from the outside. They're the ones that fight for each other when no one else will. That, to me, is the heart of this story. And it's what gives it its lasting weight.